All right, greetings everybody. This is a re-recording of the session on what is Azure Arc and Azure Arc enabled data services for the data-driven community held on January 20th, 2022. So let me get back to my screen here. So just real quick about myself. My name is Rick Heiges. I'm a senior cloud solution architect with Microsoft in the data and AI space, and I work in the U.S. manufacturing vertical. So I work with primarily about 30 different accounts, helping them with their data opportunities and how they can further that. Before joining Microsoft, I was a data platform MVP for many years and was very involved with PASS, which sadly closed its doors just about a year ago. But hopefully we'll be back at live events like SQL Saturday, and we'll be able to do this in person. So what made me get interested into Arc and Arc data services? Well, I had a customer in the manufacturing space, as you would guess, and they have multiple plants with running SQL Server without a dedicated DBA, but they were had some challenges around keeping those servers healthy and so on. So I talked to them about, hey, if you migrate that SQL Server into Azure and make it a managed instance, we'll do a lot of management for you. We'll do high availability for you. We'll do the backups for you and patching. Just make things so much easier. They said, that's great, but if the internet goes down, we stop our production because we need to talk to that SQL Server in order to keep our workflows going. So I said, that sounds like an interesting question. And I remember hearing about Arc about 2 years ago. And then just this past summer, Arc-enabled data services made its debut, and actually SQL Managed Instance went GA this past summer. So I started to dig into it further, see what it is. So let's go with the first question. What is Arc? And it is not a TLA. In other words, it's not a 3-letter acronym. It's just the name of a product offering or service from Microsoft. So what I do not know the origins of the name other than something to kind of sparked in my mind from my days in high school on the stage crew running a spotlight. And we had this old spotlight that was a carbon arc spotlight. And so a picture of a carbon arc rods in a little vacuum there. And so what would happen is you would get these two rods very close together without touching, and then you'd run electric current through it, and the electric current would arc between the two rods and make a very bright light. We would focus this light inside the spotlight onto the stage so you could light up the stage. So I imagine that's how they got the name Arc. But anyway, basically what Arc does is it extends the Azure control plane to assets outside of Azure. That means if you have bare metal servers on-prem or VMs on-prem, you can enable them with Arc. If you have servers in hosted data centers or other public clouds or Kubernetes, we leverage Kubernetes or orchestration for containers, by the way, in our data services. So we can basically extend the Arc control plane beyond Azure. And this really enables a single pane of glass view of all your data assets, helps you organize and inventory what you have, helps with governance and security, and really brings those hybrid scenarios into reality. Have role-based operations based on what role you've assigned them and who you assigned to operate those, and manage it via the Azure portal, the command line interface, or PowerShell. One thing I want to point out, though, is that because it is outside of Azure, we cannot provide service level agreements, especially financially backed SOAs, because we don't own the infrastructure, we don't own the operations. So, and those are two big things that go into maintaining SOAs. So those SOAs are owned by the customer. We'll help you as far as we can. And I think as we go through this session, you'll understand how we do that. So what do I get for enabling Arc on these servers? Well, here's some things you get just for installing the agents on either Windows or Linux servers. That is, you get resource organization through Azure Management Groups and Tags. That's pretty powerful. Searching and indexing through the Azure Resource Graph. Access and security through Azure RBAC and subscriptions. Environments and automation through templates and extensions. And last but definitely not least, update management. And I'll show you a little screenshot of what that looks like. Now, those are the things you get for free, if you will, right? These are no cost benefits. You enable Arc on your servers, you get this automatically. We do have additional value-added services that you can enable on your Arc-enabled servers, such as Azure Security Center and Azure Monitor, which have an additional cost component to them. So we'll talk about some of those as well as we get through here. So I mentioned Kubernetes, and that might be something new to you. And just so, as a little aside here, you might see Kubernetes abbreviated with with a K, 8, and S, and because we like to shorten things up, especially when we're writing about things or trying to notate things quickly. So KAS means the letter K, followed by 8 letters, and then with the letter S at the end. If you count the letters there, Kubernetes is K, 8 letters, and a letter S. So anyway, it's an open source orchestration tool for containers that makes it easier to manage those containers across multiple environments. And this is especially helpful in the microservices architectures that have really grown over the years, and really manages that herd of servers or containers, if you will. Now, back whenever I was coming of age in the IT world, right? We'd have servers. I knew their names. I knew what type of workloads they were good for. I knew how to care and feed for them. They're kind of like pets, if you will. And you can't treat servers like pets anymore. We need to treat them more like cattle or a herd of cattle. So if something goes wrong, we go out, we shoot the one that's sick, and we birth another one, basically. So anyway, but Kubernetes really helps with that, managing that herd, so that we can have increased high availability, better scalability and performance, disaster recovery, backup restore, these type of things. And when we talk about Kubernetes, we're always talking about a cluster. And we have a master node and we have worker nodes that have pods and containers with a virtual network interconnecting them. So this is a very high level view of what a Kubernetes cluster is. And this is going to be key for us to know later when we talk about Azure enabled data services later on. Sorry, Azure Arc enabled data services. Like I said, I'm a SQL Server guy, so this kind of relate to where we are today, what we can do today. So in Azure, I can run SQL Server on an Azure VM. Okay, that should be very straightforward to you, just like running SQL Server on a VM on-prem. I can also run SQL Server basically in an Azure SQL managed instance or in an Azure SQL database. Now, these last two things I mentioned, the managed instance and the Azure SQL database, those are PaaS offerings. In other words, we provide high availability. We provide the ability to scale up and down your workloads. We enable the ability for backups to be taken, both short, point in time restore type of backups, and also take advantage of long-term retention of those backups. And we do patching for you and keep you up to date with the latest and greatest bits of SQL Server. So that's a very powerful thing. And so those are the 3 ways I can run SQL in Azure. When I think about on-prem, and Arc kind of helps with the ways I can do it on-prem. So before Arc, I could have just SQL Server running on a VM or on bare metal, okay, which is great. So now with Arc, I can have now what we call an Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. Talk more about what that is, okay? But basically, I can see my SQL Server from Azure and do things with it, etc. And I can now also run an Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance on your Kubernetes. Okay, so now I have another way because of Arc. I now have 2 ways I can run SQL workloads on-prem. Kind of cool. Now, I also want to mention about another data service that we have, and that is Azure Arc enabled Postgres Hyperscale that's using Citus technology, and that is in preview right now. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is down the road here, but I just wanted to give you a little taste of what is yet to come in this session. So when we take a look at the high-level architecture of Arc-enabled SQL Server, it's pretty straightforward. Everything above the blue dotted line is Azure, and I can see my hybrid servers. I can look at some data I'm collecting from that from a performance metadata point of view. I can look at log analytics, Azure Defender, Azure Sentinel data, if I have those services enabled, by the way. And I have agents running on my SQL Server to help discover SQL servers in my environments, and enable the SQL Azure Arc extension and the monitoring agent for this value-added service I mentioned earlier. So it's a fairly straightforward way of managing or running a Arc-enabled SQL Server. So what this does is it gives us the ability to manage the entire global inventory of our SQL servers using the Azure portal as our central management dashboard, if you will. And it can help us provide better security by using some of those value-added advanced services like Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel. And also we can run on-demand SQL health checks on this environment to help you remediate risk and improve performance. So whenever we enable Arc on a SQL server and register it within Azure, the impact is negligible to the SQL Server itself, because it's just basically collecting some data about the environment itself. It does not require any data migration and causes no downtime. So basically, you still run SQL Server the way you have in the past. You just now have a window from Azure into it for managing that environment like you would with other SQL workloads you have in Azure. So what does it take for you to run, Azure Arc enabled SQL Server? So you have to have at least SQL Server 2012 or later. By the way, SQL Server 2012 has end of support coming up this summer. So if you haven't started planning on upgrading your SQL Server 2012s, you need to do that now. By the way, I think they still have the offer available. If you migrate your SQL Server 2012 workload to Azure, not just enable Arc, but you move it to Azure and run it there, you get, I think, up to 3 more years of extended security patches when you do that. But I digress. The OS you need for this is at least Windows Server 2012 R2. And if you're running SQL Server on Linux, that means you're running at least SQL Server 2017, and these are the minimum for that. There are also some permissions that you need to have set up whenever you go through this. It's well documented here at this link. in the agents, I mentioned before the Azure Connected Machine agent with the SQL Arc extension, and the Azure Monitoring agent that used to be called the Log Analytics agent is installed, and the Microsoft Monitoring agent is installed if you need Azure Security Center or some of those other value-added services. So I promised a screenshot of what the update management looks like. So when you go to your Azure portal and you find your Arc-enabled SQL servers and you open up, you click on it to open it up, and you have the overview page and things of that nature. One of the selections on the left is update management, and this is the blade that looks like. As you can see, it has updates listed below, and they're color-coded so you know which ones are more important than others. And at the very top, you can click on the little button to schedule the update deployments. So you can basically maintain your on-prem SQL Server updates from Azure. Pretty cool. And I mentioned that there is an on-demand SQL health assessment that can also be done. And this is what you would look at after the results have come in. The first green circle there is 100%, and that means that it was successful at checking everything that the assessment was meant to check. Sometimes there's things missing or security stuff isn't set up properly to access everything. So it'll give you kind of say, hey, we checked everything. In this case, everything checked out. The second one here is for security compliance. We have a few issues to address there. We have another one for availability and business continuity. And we also have one for performance. And the issues that it finds, they're weighted, and the ones that are more important are at the top. They have a bigger number, if you will. So you know which ones to address first, which ones are going to make the most impact for your time. So if you don't have a lot of time, you can concentrate on the most important things. So that's pretty cool that you can do an assessment and see the results in Azure and start affecting those changes. So we're going to wrap up this part of it. We're going to summarize the Arc-enabled SQL Server, and that is when you do it, it is basically just extending the control plane to your SQL environments. Maybe you get to have better inventory and organization and governance of those assets, and you keep familiarity of operations. In other words, you're probably not going to change very much the way that you do your daily business with SQL Server. So it's if you want to sneak into Azure just a little bit with a little toe tap, this is a great way to do it. And you extend Azure services and the added services, like the security ones and the health checks. And remember, there's no downtime or data migration when you're enabling Arc. So it's a very easy thing to enable, and you can disable it later as well. But hopefully you won't do that. So I'm going to go on to the next one. Take a sip of water here. Okay, now that stuff is pretty cool. So this is even better, in my opinion. This is Azure Arc enabled data services. This is where the cool stuff happens. This is where the cool kids hang out, right? We're going to have all the fun here in this section. So when we're talking about doing new stuff, we need to think about updating our skill sets. So I have a few things listed here that if you're not familiar with these things already, these are the things that you should probably look at improving as you go into doing the cool stuff with the cool kids. Number one is Kubernetes familiarity. There's lots of resources on the internet. I found 38 different Learn modules. So if you go to microsoft.com/learn and just type in Kubernetes, you'll find 38 Learn modules on Kubernetes itself. So it's a great place to start. And there's, again, multiple resources outside of Azure and Microsoft that you can learn Kubernetes with. GitHub. This is where you can leverage work of others and contribute back to the community on any cool stuff that you've developed and learned. And I'm learning a lot today, as a matter of fact, about GitHub. So there's lots of modules on Learn as well. I've picked out the very first one, Introduction to GitHub, list here. And then tools. If you're a SQL Server person, you probably already know how to use SQL Server Management Studio. Lately, when you've been downloading that, there's also Azure Data Studio that's been part of that download. It's also a separate download by itself, by the way. But this is another tool that's multi-platform. So it's not just Windows-based. You can run it on Linux and I think also Apple iOS. It gives you the ability to connect to a slew of Azure data services, such as, well, besides SQL Server and Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database, you can connect to Postgres and MySQL and Synapse and I think Cosmos DB. There's a bunch of different Azure-based data sources that you can connect to with Azure Data Studio. And there's also extensions that you can load into the Azure Data Studio, which make it easier for you to manage those data assets. So definitely become more familiar with Azure Data Studio. dbeaver is another tool that I recommend that you download and learn. There's a community edition, which is free, and it's basically a database agnostic workbench tool. So you can connect to, of course, SQL Server and Postgres and MySQL and Oracle and Teradata and you name it, and you can probably get the driver to connect to it. So excellent tool. There's also one more tool I'm going to mention here, and that is Lens. It's kaslens.dev is the website. And there is a personal edition, which is free. And it's basically, you can connect this tool, Lens, to your Kubernetes cluster and help you visualize what's happening within your Kubernetes cluster. So that is pretty cool. So again, you need to update your skill sets, but it can be a lot of fun learning this stuff. So go have some fun. So here's the Arc-enabled data services architecture that we're going to be talking about here. Again, very high level. But up in the left-hand corner, I have yourself as a data or Azure admin, and you can use a couple of tools. Of course, you can use the Azure portal, but you can also use Azure Data Studio with the Azure Arc extension, by the way, and also the AZ Data CLI to connect to your Azure Arc data controller and also your Kubernetes API. So your Azure Arc data controller is kind of a go-between between Azure and your data services instances, especially whenever they are in indirect connected mode. And we're going to talk about the modes here in a minute. But so the Azure Arc data controller is kind of important here. Azure Portal and Azure CLI also connect through the data controller. If you have your data services directly connected to Azure, then you get to use some of the Azure Arc integration things that we'll talk about later on. But again, very high level architecture for data services. So I'm going to talk about Azure Arc enabled managed instance, and basically you can easily create, remove, scale up, down SQL managed instance within minutes, which is incredible. Whenever I create an Azure SQL managed instance in the cloud, it takes about 3 hours from the time I hit go for it to complete in order to be up and running and accepting connections. This happens within minutes, and we're not going to really talk too much about the reasons why it takes 3 hours in Azure, but a lot of what happens here is that we're leveraging the power of Kubernetes on-prem. That's one other thing I want to mention. I'm going to talk about Azure Arc as being on-prem, although we already mentioned, right? It can also, Arc can be enabled on and hosted data centers and other public clouds. So But when I say on-prem, just think it can be outside of Azure. Okay. And of course, you can set up periodic data usage data uploads to ensure Azure bills you for the monthly SQL Server license-based products for the actual usage that you're using. And you don't even have to have it directly connected or even indirectly connected. You can have what we call an air-gapped environment where nothing is connected to the internet, but you can still get that billing and usage data to Azure. And of course, you're leveraging the latest capabilities of SQL Managed Instance. You're always running the freshest bits of MI that is constantly updated by the platform. There's no need to manage upgrades, patches, or updates or stuff like that. That's going to be continuously refreshed for you. And along with that, we are leveraging Kubernetes for built-in management services for monitoring, backup restore, and high availability. So basically, if you can't move your workload into Azure, but you want to take advantage of some of these capabilities of like managed instance, this is what this is built for, right? You can have this PaaS style built-in management capabilities on-prem. So if that internet connection goes out, you still are up and running and still have a degree of managed services for you. So let's talk about Postgres for a minute. Arc-enabled Postgres Hyperscale, again using Citus technology. So it's the same database engine that it runs in Azure. There's nothing different about it. It's the same database engine. Your data is not replicated to Azure unless you want it to be, and that's a different story. No special driver needed, command line provisioning. You can scale in, out, up, down, and we're going to explain what that means in just a minute. You pay for what you use, you have Microsoft support, and you run on any Kubernetes anywhere. So that is, in short, what Arc-enabled PostgreSQL Hyperscale is. So what about the scale in, out, up, down thing you just said? Well, so there was a company called Citus had developed this hyperscale extension to Postgres, and Microsoft acquired that company about 2-3 years ago. And so it's a pretty cool technology. Basically, you have you charge your data over multiple worker nodes and has a coordinator node to help manage the whole environment. So your coordinator mode is where your apps would connect into. It has some metadata about what is stored where, and will send the queries to the appropriate worker nodes. Sometimes has to send to all the nodes. Regardless, it's going to collect up those results and then present them back to the application. So it's truly as a coordinator. Your worker nodes basically are where the data lives across multiple nodes. And if you need to scale out, have more nodes added, that can be done very easily. And there's actually a rebalancer tool to try to keep the data equalized, if you will, across all those different nodes. And when you contract or scale in, it also moves the data as well, and it's all done automatically for you in the background. So that's the in-out. The up-down is these worker nodes can also scale up in number of cores and RAM, and also can scale down. So depending on the variability of your workload, you can basically scale. You can do hyperscaling of PostgreSQL in order to meet your workload needs. So I hope that's interesting to you. So let's get back to talking about SQL, because that's my favorite thing. So let's talk about high availability. And like I said, we use Kubernetes for high availability in the Arc-enabled SQL managed instance. And that's because the managed instance is basically a containerized application, and it uses stateful sets and persistent storage constructs within Kubernetes to provide built-in health monitoring and failover detections and maintain server's health. So we leverage Kubernetes to do that. I'm going to discuss how that happens here in just a minute. But you can further enhance that high availability with always-on availability groups under the covers. And the great thing about this is there's basically no setup or configuration that you have to worry about. It's all done for you under the covers. But let's first of all talk about the general purpose tier of high availability. That's leveraging Kubernetes redeploy, as we call it. So talk through the little pictures here. At the very top, we have a managed instance running in a container and is connected to some persistent storage. And Mr. Kubernetes is just watching things happen, making sure everything is running fine, great. And then when we say we have an issue with our managed instance and it fails, Kubernetes detects it, says, uh-oh, I need to spin up or bootstrap another container and attach the storage to it. So it goes and does that magically. And very quickly, it creates that new container, attaches the storage to it. And just like if you were to unplug the SQL Server and then plug it back in, and when it comes up, it's going to go through crash recovery. So it's going to go through the undo redo process of the logs that have been running. And it will be back online in the order of minutes. So that's how high availability is achieved through Kubernetes redeploy and persistent storage. Pretty cool, huh? So again, this is for the general purpose tier. We'll talk more about tiers in just a minute. But so if you have the most basic workload running on an Arc-enabled SQL managed instance, you're going to have this level of high availability. Pretty cool. All right, let's talk about the business critical high availability, the enhanced HA. So again, we're still leveraging Kubernetes here, but we're kind of enhancing it through a couple of different ways. Number one, we're going to have 3 replicas. So we have a primary replica, we have a readable secondary, and we have a failover replica. So our primary, of course, is our main replica. All of our writes happen there. Of course, can do reads. We have a readable secondary for scale out reads, and our failover node is just sitting there waiting for failover, basically. There is a restriction here in that there is one and only one availability group, and all of the databases are in that availability group. So you can't pick and choose like you can with regular SQL Server, to put certain databases in various availability groups and have them fill over in different places. Nope. Here we're making it very simple. Everybody is in the same boat, in the same availability group. So all databases are in that, so they all fill over at the same time. And of course, all these replicas are synchronous. So I'm going, so my readable secondary and my failover secondary are synchronous. So I'm always up to date on all these nodes. I have 3 copies of the data, each in its own persistent storage. I also have an external endpoint that's provisioned by Kubernetes for the availability group that plays the role of the listener. So whenever something bad happens to my primary, the failover is going to take over from an availability group's point of view. So the listener is going to then come over, or the endpoint, an external endpoint is going to come to the failover node, and that's going to become the new primary. In the background, I don't have pictures of this, but as you can imagine from the previous slide, Kubernetes will spin up a new managed instance, a new container, attach the old storage from the primary to it, and it'll get caught up from the new primary, which is now the failover, and go on from there. So as you can imagine, this the failover time for this is on the order of seconds, not minutes, because of all the stuff that's going on here. We have 3 copies of our data, fast failover, And again, we're back up with Kubernetes failover node in a matter of seconds. Okay. So I talked about tiers, service tiers. I alluded to them, if you will, in the previous two slides, because that is one of the main differences you have between business critical and general purpose. Is business critical has the always on availability groups built into it, and the standard or the general purpose tier has the Kubernetes redeploy and shared storage type of baseline HA, if you will, for it. But there are some other restrictions too, and that is the same restrictions that you have for standard edition of SQL Server on-prem in the box product, if you will. It's 24 cores, 128 gigs. That also is the max that you can have for a general purpose Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance. If I said that right. For Enterprise Edition or Business Critical, same as Enterprise, there are no limits. And I can get creative as far as how many cores I want to dedicate to a particular managed instance, or how much RAM. In Azure SQL managed instance in the cloud, I have predefined groupings of number of cores, and there's a certain amount of RAM that goes with each core, and that's how it is done in Azure. When you're on-prem, you have a little bit more control over things, so you can customize it so you could have, a 2-core with 128 gigs of RAM. If that's what your workload works best as, you could configure that in that manner. So you can get very creative in how you do that with this approach. So I mentioned Arc-enabled data services connectivity modes in direct mode and direct mode. And basically for indirectly connected mode, most of the services you have to do most of your management of services locally in your environment with no direct connection to Azure. So that means you're going to be connecting directly to your Arc data controller and your Kubernetes API in order to do some work there. There is billing and usage data that you can get out of your on the non-directly connected side and get that to your data controller to get that information uploaded to Azure. But there is no direct or continuous connection. So in other words, there are going to be some features that you just can't enable if you're not directly connected. With the directly connected one, basically everything's available to you. Connections are always initiated from your environment to Azure. So that's another security thing that we try to address. And it works over standard protocols and standard ports. And private endpoints are supported with this. So that's another good thing to note, because that's always a big thing with customers I talk with is, security and really leveraging private endpoints. So just one other thing to think about is when you think about the typical industries that might be indirectly connected, might be, financial services, healthcare, government for sure, probably. Whereas the directly connected ones may be more ones like retail and manufacturing. And that's really what I think about for the customer I talked about early on, was they would go into directly connected mode. And if there isn't, an internet connection disruption, it doesn't matter. They can still operate their plant because they can still see their SQL Server and do all the processing. When the connection is reestablished to the internet and to Azure, then it gets caught up. So it's one of those things where, yes, it is best to be, directly connected for their scenario, but it doesn't preclude them, if their internet connection does break down, they can still keep going. So that's kind of cool. Getting the billing usage data, I'm just going to go through this real quick. There are 3 different ways to do it for indirect. 2 of them are automated. One is totally manual. And that's all I got to say about that for right now. And for the direct connected mode, that usage and billing data is always continuously sent to Azure and is basically real time in Azure, or very close to real time. So what you see is what you get, so you don't get surprised. Whereas indirect, you have to get it up there at least monthly per our agreements. So there's, I said, there's some things you can do in directly connected mode. You can't do it indirect. Such things as Azure RBAC, access to Azure Active Directory, Azure Backup to leverage the blob storage for long-term retention, Azure Defender security services, and provisioning configuration through the portal. Those things you need to be in directly connected mode in order to be able to do those things. So just to summarize this up here, basically for Azure Arc enabled data services for managed instance, you can run that on-prem. You can customize the number of cores and the RAMs. High availability is built in. You can have enhanced HA. You can have fast deployment. You scale up, scale down, and you can still basically manage some of the, or leverage some of those past services, such as high availability is built in. You always have the latest set of bits every month, so there's no patching involved. And there's backups that are scheduled for you automatically. They're going to go to persistent storage on-prem first, but you can actually leverage that to go to Azure Blob Storage as well for long-term retention. For Hyperscale, again, same database engine that we have in Azure, and you can do that scale in, out, up, down thing that I spent some time on to really customize it to your workload. And of course, indirect and directly connected mode, some differences there. Directly connected mode gives you a lot more benefits. So I'm going to talk real quick about a playground or a sandbox environment that I've been using, and that is the Jumpstart Arcbox. Basically, it is a ARM template that you fill in some information on, you hit deploy, and at the end of about 30 minutes, you have 7 VMs deployed. You have Kubernetes deployed within there. You have Linux servers, you have Windows servers, you have Kubernetes clusters, and all the various flavors of things that we talked about today with Arc, such as Arc-enabled SQL Server, and Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance, and Arc-enabled Postgres, Hyperscale. All that stuff is in the Arcbox for you to play with. Okay. Now, from my experience, if you leave everything on, it's going to cost about 25 to 30 bucks a day, but you can turn all those VMs off and save you a lot of money that way. But it does, as I said, 7 VMs deployed with 52 cores. So you have to do it in a subscription where you have that headroom in order to do that. So you can't do this like in a Visual Studio Enterprise subscription that gives you $150 a month of spend. You just don't have the number of cores available there in order to do this. But you can, and they have some other information on the Jumpstart website, so you can deploy, let's say, Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance in Azure Kubernetes Service. Blah, if I can say that. Anyway, so there's lots of other ways you can leverage Jumpstart resources in order to learn about Azure Arc and Azure Arc data services. So whenever I deploy the Arcbox, here's a high-level architecture. As you can see, I have just about everything listed here that we talked about, and then some. So it's really a really great way of creating an environment just to play with it and learn about how this might fit in your environment. Also, I have some click-through demos that I attended another session last week on Azure Arc, and they had these Clickthrough Demos, so I borrowed them, and they're listed here for you to try out. It's basically aka.ms/arcdemo mtt 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. If you aren't used to a click-through demo, basically it presents itself as if you're in the Azure portal, and it tells you where to click on things in order to deploy certain things. Or you can just hit the right arrow and not click on anything and just watch it all do it for you. Some people find that very valuable, others do not. It's a personal preference type of thing. Just a couple other resources I want to mention here, and that is on YouTube, there is the Azure user group from Sweden, and they have the Insider's Guide to Azure Arc with 2 MVPs, Carol DeWinter and Wim Matheson. Excellent meeting. These guys are really big into Arc, and I think you'll see their passion and you'll learn a lot from them. Of course, the Azure Arc Jumpstart website I mentioned, and Azure Arc Jumpstart Demos, which is a YouTube channel full of demos of Arc and discussions about Arc. And then we also have a Learn module that I have a link to here. And this was put together by Buck Woody and Bob Ward. So if you're from the SQL Server community, you should definitely know those names and know that this learning would be top-notch for you for the Azure Arc Enabled Data Services Learn module. And also just last week, we released a customer story from John Deere talking about how they leveraged Azure Arc data services in their environment. So I urge you to go check out these other resources and learn more about Azure Arc and Azure Arc data enabled services. So with that, thank you very much for being here with me today. And I hope to see many of you in person, hopefully sooner than later. Again, thank you very much.